Hello, everyone. We are the Carnegie Mellon University Student Capstone team working with ICIT to further assess cybersecurity risk and threats to education, be it K through 12 and higher ed. My name is Mack. I am the project manager for the team. I am joined today by Regan, who is our research and writing lead, Lexi, who is our process and documentation manager, Jordan is one of our threat intel researchers focused primarily on higher education, and Saurabh is our other threat intel researcher focused primarily on K through 12. We also want to highlight our project advisor, Dan Cambitt from CMU, and thank ICIT for the opportunity for this project and to present our findings to you. So the bottom line up front, before we really get started, what we do want to highlight here is that our findings really led us to acknowledge that cybersecurity in education is indeed a growing concern, and it requires more attention than what it's getting. The risks associated in this space, they need to be assessed and managed through policy, technology, and cultural mindset. Moving forward, we do recommend here that schools implement basic security hygiene practices, instill a culture of resilience and security, and invest heavily, or more heavily rather, in preventative measures to mitigate cyber incidents in the future. So this is just a brief agenda of what we're going to be covering today. We'll start with a brief overview of the project background and the scope, dive into a little bit of the impact and outcome, kind of the objectives of the research project itself. We'll highlight some key stakeholders, our research methodology, and then getting into really the bulk of the information today is our research and analysis, so recommendations on how to mitigate cyber incidents and security gaps in schools, as well as address a secondary question of should education itself be considered a critical infrastructure sector on its own. We'll also highlight some future work opportunities in this same space, as well as discuss our lessons learned. So before we dive too far into the project itself, we do want to highlight our project sponsor, ICIT, which is the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. They are the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank, providing research, advisory services, and education to a number of stakeholders in the government sector, commercial, and public. Our direct sponsors have been Joyce Hunter, the executive director, Dr. Catherine McIver, the content manager for ICIT, and Drew Spaniel, lead researcher. So as a bit of project background and context, what we really did was assess cybersecurity risk and threat to education institutions by looking at critical assets and targets, identifying key stakeholders, looking at practices and policies that are currently being implemented by schools, as well as threat intelligence research. The overall scope of the project included higher education, which consists of public and private universities, community colleges, trade schools, really any type of education after high school, as well as K through 12 institutions, which consist of public and private schools, elementary through high school, everything in between there to include special education and alternative programs. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Lexi, who's going to dive further into our key stakeholders.
So as we were implementing our research findings and going about our research process, we wanted to look at three key groups of stakeholders. The first is from an educational perspective. Obviously, this includes students, their parents or guardians, the faculty and staff, as well as the reputation of the institutions themselves. Secondly, we wanted to look at organizations, both local and federal, so ICIT being somewhat local, and then we wanted to look at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a subset of the Department of Homeland Security. This was important from a cybersecurity perspective, and then additionally we wanted to look at the Federal Department of Education and some relevant offices within the DOE. And then finally, we did want to take an adversarial perspective when we were doing our threat intelligence, and so we included threat actors as a stakeholder, including advanced persistent threats and cyber criminals. We also wanted to take into consideration existing regulations. So there are two main laws or regulations that govern student privacy, and these are FERPA, which protects educational records, as well as the PPRA amendment, which also deals with student privacy, but from a survey and analysis perspective. Additionally, we wanted to look at relevant government institutions, which includes the U.S. Department of Education and any regulations that they may hand down, as well as state and local educational administrations. From there, we wanted to create a white paper as our project outcome, which included threat intelligence information, identification of critical assets and targets, a much more in-depth walkthrough of those key stakeholders, a qualitative risk analysis use case, and then recommendations for how schools should proceed with their cybersecurity moving forward. And overall, those things combined, we wanted to create an assessment of the state of cybersecurity in educational institutions as it exists. The impact of this project is that we wanted to foster an increased understanding of cyber risk in schools and how to mitigate and remediate those risks based on our recommendations. Additionally, we wanted to increase understanding of what typical threat vectors might look like for educational institutions so that those institutions can better protect against them. We also wanted to inform discussions on what better cyber hygiene in schools might look like, and that consideration for education as a critical infrastructure sector. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Regan to talk more about our research and analysis phase.
Thank you. So now we're going to focus on the research that we found throughout the project. And it's important to recognize that our research is focused on three main areas. First being foundational open source information gathering. Second being interviews that we had with industry leaders. And then third would be threat intelligence work that we did in order to see, what type of threats are targeting education. So first, we feel that it's really crucial to acknowledge that education experiences several challenges, especially the variation that exists among schools. Throughout the course of our project, we've been referring to this as sort of an apples, oranges, and bananas analogy. They're all fruit, but they look, they smell, they taste very different. So when we look at education, we have many examples of schools, but they are all different in many ways. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to schools. Each have their own challenges, and what works for one may not work for another. Furthermore, there are other nuances, especially when we look towards budgeting, which can vary, by institution, by district, and even by state. So pushing a little further, we wanted to identify three main case studies that we feel demonstrate how educational institutions are a target and can be attacked in a variety of ways. So the first of those would be an attack that actually happened very recently in March of 2022 in New York City. In this case, over 800,000 students' information was compromised. And this is essentially the largest K-12 hack on record. And the information compromised included, things like names and addresses, but even students' race, their families' socioeconomic status, if the student receives any type of learning accommodations, what their grades are, amongst a number of other things. And this breach was directly related to an education management system noted as Illuminate. They essentially weren't very forthcoming in their security practices, specifically in terms of encryption. And because of that, the entire confidentiality, integrity, and availability of this information was violated, especially because students and teachers were unable to access the systems for several days. And as you can imagine, given how recent it was, there is an investigation still ongoing. Moving on to our next case study would be two attacks in a span of 4 months that happened at Michigan State University. The first attack was a ransomware that they experienced over Memorial Day weekend in 2020. In this case of the ransomware, the school decided not to pay the ransom. They decided this through collaboration with local law enforcement and wanting to not perpetuate these types of attacks. They were kind of prepared in a way. They had backups. They were able to press forward. There was some information that was leaked from the perpetrators that, instigated the ransomware, but this was nothing personally identifiable or anything of that nature. 4 months later, the school experienced another attack, but this time it was on its online merchandise store. And in this case, personal and financial data was compromised. So there was no direct link between the two attacks, but we found it really interesting that it was a single institution that was attacked 2 separate times in a span of less than 6 months. And then the last example is an insider threat attack, which happened in Miami-Dade County, located in Florida. In this case, a student, I believe about 15 or 16 years old, initiated several distributed denial of service attacks against the district. I think there was a total of 8 attacks, and they took down the entire IT system, which is really important to consider given that this county, this district, is the 4th largest school district in the United States. So because of this, students were unable to access their virtual classrooms. They were down for several days, and there was obviously a disruption to the normal operations of learning. Looking at our second component of our research was our interviews. We were lucky enough to speak with several individuals on the topic of cybersecurity in education. On the right, I've listed out those individuals, and we were put into contact with them through a variety of methods, whether it be our own, professional connections, our connections through Carnegie Mellon or Heinz College, and also our connection with our sponsor through ICIT and their fellowship program. The discussions we had were incredibly helpful because it enabled us to have a valuable insight into several areas of cybersecurity and also education. And many of the conversations we had were the foundational basis for our recommendations that we will touch on later. So with that said, I'm going to pass it on to Saurabh, who will talk about our third element of research, which was threat intelligence.
Thanks, Regan. So our research methodology consisted of doing open source intelligence gathering through government websites, government-funded researchers, social media platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, and also doing some research on Tor. Some of the frameworks studied were the Cisco Umbrella Threat Report, the Red Canary Report, and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. From our research, what we gathered is that research into APTs, cyber criminals, is not always straightforward, and it takes a lot of time, effort, and funding. Moving on to the next slide. We can see that since the onset of the pandemic, the number of cyber attacks on K-12 institutions has significantly increased. With 2020 reporting, there were like 400 attacks reported on K-12 institutions in 2020, which was a significant rise over the previous few years. This pie chart depicts the attacks that were conducted on these schools. Data breaches were one of the most common attacks that were conducted, and these involved attacks on both student and staff data, and comprised of about 36% of all attacks reported. Another commonly reported attack was ransomware, and we also saw that extortion demands made to schools significantly increased. In some cases, they even exceeded over $1 million per incident. Another common attack was denial of service, where students and staff were denied access to resources, which sometimes led to cancellation of classes and a lot of disruption to the learning experience. Other ever-present attacks, such as phishing, were also observed. The last category refers to other unattributed malware, class invasions, email disruptions, website, social media defacement, and any other variety of low-frequency incidents that comprise about 45% of all reported attacks. Now I will briefly talk about some of the APTs we researched and the methodology used by them. It's important to note that all these APTs have targeted higher education or K-12 institutions in the past couple of years. So, Charming Kitten is an Iranian hacking group which has targeted scientific research organizations and online educational platforms. This APT has been linked to several ongoing credential stealing operations. And according to research by Microsoft, this APT also made over 2,500 attempts to attack email accounts with the aim of targeting the US presidential campaign in 2019. This resulted in over 240 attacks and 4 compromised accounts. However, fortunately, none of the compromised accounts were related to the election directly. Another cyber criminal is a Silver Terrier, which is a Nigerian hacking syndicate. So at the moment, it is not clear whether Silver Terrier can be classified as an advanced persistent threat, only because there isn't enough evidence at the moment to show that they are state-sponsored. However, they have been one of the most prolific hacking groups, mainly targeting large businesses. These criminals have collectively produced more than 81,000 samples of malware and have been linked to over 2 million attacks. The most common tools that Silver Terrier actors have used to attack organizations are remote access Trojans or rats and information stealers.
So now that we've addressed the current risk landscape, we want to identify and review some of our scope-specific recommendations. These will detail ways to handle risk and improve cyber maturity across these institutions, while also taking into account several problem areas that we've identified through our research. So first, we wanted to include these example risk matrices in order to frame risk in some tangible way. Through our research, we recognize that many risk frameworks tend to be more enterprise focused. And as you'll see as we kind of dig into our recommendations, we have acknowledged the fact that educational institutions, while they may at times operate in a business-like fashion, they're very, very different from our typical enterprise. So in saying that, we kind of devised our own matrix, which has been split between the next 2 slides. And in this, we've highlighted priorities that we feel schools care about more, which in comparison to enterprises may be slightly different. And these priorities are ranked. So for educational institutions, their first priority would be the safety of students and staff. And in this category, you can see things like information security, cybersecurity, and even physical security. And in this matrix, we've also detailed the amount of risk that these institutions are willing to take in given a associated risk event, and then a corresponding risk response strategy. So, looking under the cybersecurity category, we see risk events like an impact to the student's availability to, have online learning. Is there some type of disruption that would prevent the student from learning that day? Given that priority of the safety of students and staff is number 1, in this case, the appetite would be incredibly low, and its response would be to mitigate through proper security controls, protocols, policies, practices. And because of this, it's because educational institutions want to prioritize learning continuity. What will allow students to come to school every day and be able to receive the education that they're guaranteed. If you want to switch to the next slide, please. Now looking at another priority, which in this case would be priority 4, is financial. This is where we see a really huge departure from educational institutions versus an enterprise, where an enterprise may see financial as their number 1 priority. Educational institutions have it a little bit lower. Drawing your attention to the student development and also additional services category under financial, we see different elements of student development outside of the classroom. So things like field trips, volunteer opportunities, and extracurricular opportunities. While these types of activities are crucial to student development, they're not necessarily critical to maintaining learning continuity. So as you can see here, the appetite switches to a high incurrence. The strategy would be to accept, like I said, because they are not critical to overall learning continuity. So with that said, that brings us to our first recommendation, which is mission enablement. We can define mission enablement as the ability for an educational institution to uphold their mission statement and overall develop on their promises and guarantees to stakeholders. And like I've previously said, the primary focus within mission enablement is to maintain learning continuity. So in order to do this, there are a few areas that we've identified. The first would be tailoring the language around cybersecurity within education. Cybersecurity needs to be interpreted as a necessary component of learning operations so as to provide the best possible educational experience for students. As it stands, much like risk management, the language regarding cybersecurity can be primarily enterprise focused. Schools are not necessarily concerned with financial loss or market disruption the way an enterprise may be. So because of that, security needs to be framed from an educational perspective, focused on promoting that learning continuity rather than revenue or business continuity. In many ways, we've interpreted this as moving from scare to care. We don't want people to view cybersecurity as, something to scare them or shield them from, the dark and scary internet. We want cybersecurity to be instilled as a necessary measure in order to maintain a positive learning environment and prioritize things like the safety and security of students, faculty, and staff, which we could, equalize to having locks on the school or classroom doors. Pushing a little bit further is also creating this culture of resilience and security. So when we talk about a culture of resilience, this places a greater emphasis on things like lessons learned, awareness, and even transparency in regard to security. It's dependent entirely on accountability. So for example, if a teacher is sent a phishing email and upon clicking on it was notified that the email was in fact phishing, a security mindset would be that the teacher acknowledges that they shouldn't open emails from that sender again. A resilience mindset would be to use this event as a learning experience and perhaps provide some type of security awareness training for employees regarding phishing. So security and resiliency are largely codependent, and an institution becomes much more secure as it becomes more resilient. So we believe that this type of mindset can be fostered from the top down. And lastly is the prioritization of asset management, especially in the case of K-12 schools, where many of their IS and IT teams are comprised of 1 to 2 people. Having a proper asset inventory allows a greater visibility into what currently exists in the IT environment, and it thus makes it easier to secure those assets even with a smaller or less experienced team. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to Mack, who's going to address ransomware.
So as Regan and both Saurabh pointed out, ransomware is a prevalent threat and it's increasing in just about every capacity, whether it be just education or any other type of industry. So with that, we wanted to address, one of the bigger questions surrounding ransomware is, do you pay the ransom or not? So just as a bit of context, and this is not specific to higher education or K-12 or education in general, but just generally speaking, the average ransom actually calls for roughly $140,000 and usually kind of ties in with roughly 23 days of downtime. Of all of the ransomware victims, only 11% actually received full data recovery, whether they paid the ransom or not. So with that, the consensus really is to do not pay. Through our interviews with cybersecurity experts, and we even consulted organizational documents from the FBI, everything points to do not pay. There's no guarantee that you're going to get your data back if you do pay, and paying in some contexts could actually incentivize future ransomware attacks. So if they're not giving their data back, but you're still paying, they're going to continue to do these attacks if they're getting a good payday out of it. So with that, our recommendation moving forward is for institutions to invest in preventative measures up front. This includes, data backups separate from the rest of the system, implementing technological controls such as, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, any type of technical control and monitoring software. With that, it's also understood that not every organization, every school is going to have the resources, whether it be funding, personnel, expertise, have the necessary resources to implement this. So with that, we asked them to, really assess the cost of security upfront. So integrating these preventative measures versus the cost of recovery. So if you pay the ransom, the cost to recover the data and any type of intangible costs that also play into here is like a loss of trust, or a loss of reputation as a result of a ransomware attack. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lexi to dive more into the general cybersecurity hygiene practices we recommend.
Thanks, Mac. So as we were talking with people who had experience in the educational space, one of the main patterns we identified was the concept of a high resource constraint school versus a low resource constraint school. And a high resource constraint school, it's pretty obvious based on what it is titled, but those are schools that have a high level of constraint in how they can spend their resources. So they have not a lot of funding that they need to do a lot of different things with. And as a result, cybersecurity can often get pushed by the wayside for these organizations, or they don't have the staff or the resources necessary to implement a robust cybersecurity program and, an entire framework. On the other hand, we do also address in our final paper the concept of a lower resource constraint school, and for those schools, we do go through recommendations for frameworks. However, here we're going to focus on one of the biggest recommendations that we received throughout the course of our interviews, which is the concept of cyber hygiene. And what we mean by that is instead of, having to go through an entire framework, a school is just going to make basic changes that can really improve their cybersecurity. The two that we have identified as being best able to combat threat attacks that we're going to be seeing are robust and comprehensive backups. And this dovetails quite a bit into what Mac was just discussing in terms of ransomware. Backups are going to be the best way to combat the ransomware attack vector. Additionally, multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is going to cut down greatly on fraudulent sign-in attempts and access to schools and networks. And this is going to cut down on a lot of attacks before they can even be realized. If a student or staff has to authenticate their device additionally in a second way or a third way, as opposed to just being able to sign on via a stolen password. In addition, we identified additional cyber hygiene methods, including properly configured and enforced password management, basic patch and update management, and acceptable use policy, which is especially important during a time of remote education and device lending, installing reputable antivirus software and firewalls. This doesn't always have to be purchasing something new. It can also be taking full advantage of resources that schools have already purchased. And then finally, user awareness training. We can have the best security in the world at our schools, and if students and staff and teachers don't know how to properly interact with their devices, the technical security measures are going to be insufficient. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to detail current trends that we're seeing in educational cyberspace.
Thanks, Lexi. So as mentioned, we'll go over some current trends that we've seen organizations move to increase their cyber hygiene. First, cloud migration. Many companies across industries have moved a portion, if not all, resources to the cloud. The cloud allows for a more secure environment. There are a number of companies that offer cloud services such as Amazon Web Services, VMware, and Infoblox. These solutions could be most useful for school corporations with a lower budget and smaller IT teams. Next, zero trust architecture. Zero trust treats all users as external to the company. This forces employees, regardless of role or status within an organization, to authenticate themselves each time a request is made for internal resources. The issue here is the architecture is fairly complex to implement. Many schools and universities rely on legacy systems, which would need to be updated in order to implement zero trust. Finally, a security operations center, or SOC. Many of us are already familiar with a SOC, which provides around-the-clock security. However, we have discussed a twist to the standard way of running a SOC, which will be discussed on the next slide. So in our interview with Dr. Bruce Young, he mentioned a way in which Harrisburg University kind of operates their own SOC, and we kind of took that and made our own twist of it. So take a given state, for example, this will have a collaboration between state and local government, state universities, as well as K-12 organizations throughout different counties. So take Pennsylvania, for example. Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Pittsburgh, and Penn State University could foster a number of counties and have their own security operations center. This could be used as a pipeline to have local high school students at the university to create jobs both at the university level and at the state. So as mentioned early on in the presentation, a secondary objective for our project was to consider education being added as the 17th critical infrastructure sector. While it was difficult to come to a determination as to whether education should be added, we were able to lay out some pros and cons. First and foremost, for the pros, it allows for increased funding and standardization. This also allows for a long-term strategy for education for better cyber development and streamlined interdependencies with other critical infrastructure sectors. Some of the cons, however, is it limits flexibility regarding enforcement of securities. Bigger universities could have different enforcement compared to K-12 and smaller universities. This could also draw unwanted attention to education institutions. And finally, most attacks to education are for financial gain. And from a financial perspective, education simply isn't on par with other critical infrastructure sectors. And finally, some of the future work we deem necessary. First, educational risk management. It's important to have a deeper understanding of how schools address and identify risk. Next is centralized SOC, which I've already gone over a little bit, so I won't harp on that too much. Then understanding the education perspective on cybersecurity. Throughout this process, it's been pretty difficult to connect with schools regarding cybersecurity, but it's important to note that they stand to benefit from this research. Then educational as a critical infrastructure sector, which also I've discussed in the previous slide, so I won't go into that more. And then promoting cybersecurity education. As we all know, there's kind of a lack of cybersecurity expertise in educational institutions due to a lack of resources. Many students who are just entering the cybersecurity realm tend to go private industry simply because funding is there and the pay is better. So it's important to mention, the SOC operations idea that we had a few slides ago. This could create a pipeline and keep student expertise in the industry. Finally, Mack will go over the lessons learned as well as a conclusion.
Thanks, Jordan. Okay, so some of the lessons learned are tied directly to what we found as far as our research, as well as what we discovered through the research process. As Jordan highlighted, one of the biggest things here is not many of these institutions really want to discuss cybersecurity, especially those who have had breaches or ransomware attacks in the past. We were lucky enough to get 7 different interviews scheduled and conducted throughout our research. But in addition to that, we had reached out to roughly 13 to 15 other institutions who did not even respond to any type of request, didn't really acknowledge it at all. So with that, we really understand now how difficult it is to conduct research in this space because nobody wants to talk about it. Another thing too is that awareness and training are as critical as technical measures. When I say technical measures here, again, that's anything from like firewalls to system configurations to network settings. Awareness and training is just as important as those in an effective cybersecurity program. These controls in regards to technology, they don't account for social engineering. So you can have the most robust, the most secure system and network in the world, but if you have employees clicking on phishing links, then it really renders all of that security ineffective because someone else is opening the door for them anyway. Another thing we realized too, looking at education, is that there's a significant lack of resources and expertise in education institutions when it comes to cybersecurity. A lot of the individuals who are trained and have the expertise and experience in cybersecurity are migrating more toward the technical industry or the defense sector. There's not really too many people who have significant cybersecurity expertise working in education institutions helping to protect those specific networks. So with that, cybersecurity kind of has fallen to the side. It's not a top priority among schools. Notably, whenever the COVID-19 pandemic really started, pushed everything online, the biggest priority at this context was for institutions just to get onto an online platform. Teachers needed a place to educate, and students needed a place to learn. So security really became secondary in this context. And then after students started coming back to school, the new priority was, mask mandates or social distancing. So again, cybersecurity really kind of fell back and has not really been seen as a top priority in education institutions. And then finally, kind of more on a positive note, as we said before, cyber is a growing concern, but this project really has illustrated that there are organizations out there working to bring more awareness to this. There are companies out there developing frameworks, cyber risk frameworks specifically for education institutions. There are a lot of other institutions conducting research into this space, learning how to bridge this, the gap between education and cybersecurity. So moving forward, it is nice to see that there is some positive, and hopefully this helps to kind of push forward this idea that cybersecurity needs to be more of a organizational mindset in education moving forward. So lastly, just to kind of tie all this together, just want to reiterate one last time that cybersecurity in education really requires more attention when it's getting. There is some attention received now, but it's not enough to where it needs to be to really be effective. And to really manage all of this, schools need to integrate, policy, technology, and culture, instituting basic cyber hygiene practices, assessing and managing risk and assets, instilling a mindset based on security and resiliency, which helps to bridge the communication gap between the technology and security side with the administrative and school side. Also looking to assess cybersecurity as a prevention versus response, and then kind of wrapping it all together with accountability. Roles and responsibilities need to be assigned clearly and effectively early so that everyone within the organization knows their role and know what they're responsible to do. And then again, there are plenty of future research opportunities within this space. So with that, we're going to answer a few questions that have been posed to us.
Okay, so our first question is, given recent attacks on K-12, such as the Illuminate breach and the disruptionware attacks on higher education, such as the Lincoln College attack, what more should education policymakers, administrators, and other stakeholders do to improve the resiliency and security of academic systems? So this is a really great question. We addressed this in a little bit more detail in our white paper, especially in regard to listing out all of our stakeholders and our overall recommendations. But I kind of wanted to break it down into 3 primary groups just for the sake of this presentation to offer a little bit more insight into kind of where our recommendations lie in regard to stakeholders. So starting first kind of from the top down, when we're looking at policymakers and administrators, one key component that we feel is really valuable is for these individuals or entities to acknowledge the interdependencies and the high value targets that exist within education, and then address this when it comes to things like funding. So when we're talking interdependencies, this can be especially prevalent in higher education. One example is in regard to university health insurance. Many states like Pennsylvania requires university students to have health insurance. So whether it be their own personal private plan or the university's plan that they offer. Because of that requirement, universities then have partnerships with insurance companies, they have partnerships with hospital branches, and because of that, there are greater interdependencies that are created between education and other industry. Furthermore, there may be blatant advertisement of these partnerships on websites, in the news, in media. So this initially places a larger target on their backs, because not only are we just, having education as a potential target, there's now the ability for a malicious actor to hop from education to another industry or another sector because of the interdependencies and connections. Furthermore, like I previously stated, education can be incredibly varied, especially state by state. And this is especially important when we talk about funding. It varies by district, it varies by state, which is something that would obviously be to the attention of policymakers and administrators. Not only an investment of resources, but an investment of time. Many schools and districts have already purchased products, subscriptions, services, but they don't know how to implement them, or they just have let them kind of sit. This investment of time can also be translated into the need to invest in the workforce. New tools and technology is great to have. That's kind of how we're continuing to advance. But if you can't manage them, security becomes an even greater concern. So this is sort of tied to the concept that Jordan touched on about the SOC concept, acknowledging that there's a need to retain talent within education when it comes to cybersecurity, and also a need to invest in time and also resources in order to allow schools to adequately prepare themselves. When we look towards teachers and other staff or other educators, this can be akin to similar industries, you know, following policies that are put into place by admin, by policymakers, and also awareness training that not only touches on what they should be doing, but why they're doing it. This lends itself to, again, bridging that gap in language within cybersecurity and education. You know, identifying to educators why it's important that cybersecurity is a key component of learning continuity. Additionally, learning from past incidents or incidents at other institutions. I think the Illuminate breach is something that was incredibly eye-opening, especially given the enormity of the breach. And it should push schools, whether it be an admin, teachers, or other staff, to look into the vendors that they're using, building that culture of security and resiliency, holding them accountable, ensuring that they're delivering on their guarantees in their products and in their practices. And lastly, for students, parents, and guardians, it's again stressing that importance of the why. You know, students don't necessarily maybe see why someone hacking into their Illuminate or their Canvas or their Blackboard really matters. You know, it's just grades or assignments or quizzes. Whereas we, as more security-minded people, would know that, you know, it's not just grades or assignments. You know, getting into a Canvas account could lead to getting into a student portal, which could lead accessing health information, financial information, and it kind of branches out from there. So this is what really needs to be addressed. We need to ensure that we're adequately explaining the why this is important to students, their parents, and their guardians, and why they should care about protecting themselves. So this goes back to what Lexi highlighted in terms of cyber hygiene, you know, awareness training, student and parent acknowledgement of computing policies where that's appropriate, and also continuing to adhere to school policies in addition to a number of other items.
Okay, so the next question really is addressing how can increasing cyber hygiene and awareness, you know, in education curriculums help to reduce this U.S. Cyber talent shortage. So this is another interesting question. With October being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, I think one way schools could really implement this is maybe have it either, you know, it drawn out over the month or a specific like Cyber Awareness Day integrated within the curriculum where students, the only thing they really talk about, like whether for an afternoon or the entire day, is cybersecurity issues. They could have one, you know, lesson where somebody presents on, you know, current threats in cybersecurity. The next lesson could discuss, you know, good cyber hygiene practices, kind of awareness, you know, good do's and don'ts that they can, you know, follow or not follow, respectively. And then I think they could also have a class where somebody comes in and talks about, you know, cybersecurity related fields. I think, at least personally, my own personal experience, I think there's a lot of misconception about what kind of roles are actually within the cybersecurity field. I think a lot of people think it's super technical, and there's a huge range of the very technical to the, you know, policy and risk. So I think kind of opening and expanding that to students, kind of letting them know the different types of career positions that they could kind of seek out later on would be definitely beneficial. And I think the best way to kind of address this really is to not, leave it on the administrators or the teachers to, address this or teach this during the day, but maybe open it up to leadership throughout the local community within the cyberspace. Have volunteers come and as part of like a day of helping, or a kind of community outreach program that an organization might have to come in and like some cyber experts can educate children and students on this. I think one obvious caveat here too is to they can't do the same level of education at every grade level. Maybe have this maybe more focused on high school students down to middle school, and then you just kind of have basic, very general things for students in elementary schools. I mean, because they're still using their things like YouTube and iPads and tablets. So I think some sort of general education would help there. But I think this overall idea would help to kind of bridge, the gap and kind of create that mindset early on that cyber is important. Kind of if anyone is familiar with the DARE program, the anti-drug and alcohol program they used to have in schools, it kind of raised awareness. So I think this idea could really build off of that and kind of just take it a step further to, say, this is what it is, this is what the issues are, this is how to, be safe online, and this is, moving forward, if you're interested in this, these are the types of jobs that you could really, pursue in this space.
So the final question that we received asks, what type of mechanisms, including regulation and legislation, do we believe prove most effective in compelling educational stakeholders to prioritize cybersecurity? And this question goes back in a lot of ways to the resource constraint that we discussed earlier, which is that it's often not that schools do not wish to prioritize cybersecurity. It's more so that a robust cybersecurity program is an expensive undertaking that requires a lot of resources. And especially if we're looking at, for example, one of the high resource constraint schools we identified would be a rural public prior to higher education program. So whether that's a middle school, a preschool, anything like that, those schools do not always have a ton of resources. So when we're looking at how we want to solve that, it's important to note that legislation of any kind, which would be certainly beneficial in standardizing, because as Regan discussed earlier, there is very much a patchwork of regulation across areas. So one state might have very robust requirements for their cybersecurity reporting and compliance, and another state might have limited, and then we can even get down into a granular district level, and it might vary that way as well. So when we're looking at some standardizing, which would be helpful from an enforcement and overall cyber hygiene perspective and in reducing our national attack surface, we want to make sure that any legislation that is passed also has a heavy focus on resource and education. So, or allocating resources in education, excuse me. So by that, I mean, if we're going to mandate that all schools follow X, Y, and Z best cyber hygiene practices, we need to back that up with, here's the resources that you can use to implement that specifically. And here are subject matter experts that are available. Here's a helpline, here is something that we can use to help guide schools through this process of increasing their cyber hygiene. But certainly when we're looking at legislation, it would be helpful to have some degree of forced baseline, and additionally metrics beyond that that might be helpful. We just need to make sure to include those resources. And with that, that was our final question.
I'd just like to conclude by again thanking ICIT and Carnegie Mellon University for providing the opportunity for us to kind of dive into this research question. Hopefully the white paper and presentation here really help to kind of drive more awareness and change within cybersecurity in education institutions. So thank you.